Extraordinary, iconic, lethal. These incredible ships have told our story for the past 400 years and defined what it means to be part of our island nation. I'm Rob Bell, and in this series, I'll be exploring Britain's greatest ships. This time, I uncover the story behind perhaps the most famous ship in the world, the Titanic. The biggest ship ever built. She was a sensation before she even set sail.
This place is just epic.
The Titanic boasted the very latest technology, but her maiden voyage ended in a catastrophic loss of life.
That's a disaster. The whole thing was chaos, and it shouldn't have been.
She was said to be unsinkable. So how did Titanic become the most famous maritime disaster in history? At the beginning of the 20th century, shipbuilding was booming. Huge British ports like Belfast in Northern Ireland were hammering out ever bigger, better and faster ships to move people and goods around the world on a scale never seen before. The Harland and Wolff shipyard lies in the heart of Belfast. In 1908, they were commissioned by the White Star shipping line to build a game-changing passenger ship that would strike awe into anyone who saw it.
This new liner wasn't just going to be the most luxurious, it would also be the biggest ship the world had ever seen. And they gave it a fitting name, the Titanic.
But its maiden voyage was to end in disaster. The Titanic has been lying on the seabed for over 100 years. It seemed we'd lost all connections to this legendary ship. But in 2013, a piece of living history returned to Belfast docks.
This is the SS Nomadic. Now, you might be thinking that she looks vaguely familiar. Well, she was the Titanic's original tender. So she has the same lines and the same livery as her bigger sister. The Nomadic is the only remaining White Star ship anywhere in the world. And her original job was ferrying passengers out to the Titanic for that first and last voyage across the Atlantic.
Today, the Nomadic is the closest you can get to boarding the Titanic.
Walking along this very same deck that those passengers did over 100 years ago, you can just imagine the levels of excitement and the buzz that there would have been on board. Those passengers perhaps clinging on to this railing as they steam towards the great mass of the Titanic. It would have been an imposing sight. At 14 stories high, it was the largest ship ever built, and it would have towered above them.
To give an idea of Titanic's size, its museum, here on the docks where the ship was built, is the same height as its hull. But building the world's biggest ship created a problem for the White Star Line. If nobody built the world's biggest ports, it would have nowhere to go.
The White Star Line took a monumental gamble. Imagine that the jumbo jet doesn't exist, but somebody comes along and they have an idea to build the jumbo jet. Well, no airport has a runway long enough. And that is exactly what the White Star Line did. They went ahead and ordered Harland and Wolff to build the world's largest liners when there was no docks capable of handling the vessel.
White Star Line managed to persuade key ports to extend piers and dredge deeper channels. But why did the Titanic need to be so big? It was all part of a daring new business plan to carry as many of a profitable new type of customer as possible.
Titanic was essentially an immigrant ship. Her official designation with the British government was the immigrant ship Titanic. And so the prime reason really for building the Titanic was because of mass migration. That's third-class passengers. The second and the first class was really, if you like, the jam on top of the bread and butter. But the bread and butter is the bit that actually paid for the Titanic to be built and paid for her to be operated.
The Titanic's size meant there was room for each class to occupy their own zones, even with separate promenade decks. It's most famous for its first-class passengers, who travelled in incredible luxury. At the Titanic Museum, you can see for yourself how the ship was designed to give them a whole separate world, on top of the emigrant masses below.
Passengers and crew alike had never seen a ship built on this scale before. You can see here there were 10 deck levels in total. And in the top half of the ship, you had these open, airy spaces for first-class passengers, where the designers freed up whole sweeping areas to accommodate jaw-dropping features, like glass roof staircases, long promenade decks.
The Titanic was the biggest movable man-made object the world had ever seen. So how did Harland and Wolff meet the challenge of building such a gigantic ship? Ironically, the biggest problem wasn't in making it float, it was building it on dry land. Normally, a ship's hull took shape on a slipway supported by a gantry. If the blocks under the keel were just half an inch out, the whole ship could break in two. Engineers managed to balance its entire 882 feet to perfection. The slipway where the Titanic was built is still here today, and it gives an idea of the sheer scale of the problem. Even long-established shipbuilding techniques would become fraught with new dangers.
Once the hull was watertight, the Titanic faced what should have been its most perilous journey, from land here, out into the estuary.
Titanic's slightly smaller sister ship, Olympic, was the first to launch. A dangerous feat never attempted on this scale before. As soon as ships were released from the support of the gantry, they needed to slide into the water as quickly as possible to avoid keeling over. Despite the high-tech solutions like steam release mechanisms to help Titanic slide down the slipway, engineers hedged their bets with a method they've probably been using since before the Ark.
To ease its path and reduce friction, shipbuilders used an age-old trick. 22 tons of rendered beef fat and soap were smeared all over the slipway right down to the water's edge. No doubt, there are probably a few crossed fingers involved too.
They had no guarantee it would work. A crowd of 100,000 gathered to hold its breath, while the massive hull gently slid over beef dripping an inch thick into the estuary. Once the hull had been successfully launched, the next step was to tow it into a dry dock. With the gate closed, the surrounding water could be pumped out and construction of the vessel completed. And of course, Titanic was going to need the world's biggest dry dock to be built.
This is the dry dock that Harland and Wolff had to build to fit out the hull. It's almost impossible to take in the sheer scale of this place. Titanic is definitely the word. That's taken me almost 3 minutes to walk from one end to the other.
With the dry dock drained of water, the empty hull of the Titanic could become a masterpiece in steel. But these were the days before welding. Thousands of steel plates up to an inch thick had to be hammered together by hand with 3 million rivets.
It took 15,000 men to build the Titanic. And you can just imagine the noise and the industrial clamour that would have been echoing off of these walls. This place is just epic.
After a construction cost equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds today, the Titanic set sail on its first Atlantic crossing to New York. For passengers in France, the tender ship Nomadic would herald this whole new way of travelling.
Passengers boarded the Nomadic here to be ferried across to the Titanic. And it was on board this vessel that they got their very first taste of the incredible ship they were about to experience. But the story of the Titanic's maiden voyage was to become unforgettable for very different reasons. How could a state-of-the-art ship with so much money invested in it come to such a catastrophic end?
Belfast docks still bear the marks of building the biggest ship the world had ever seen. And the Titanic is not just famous for its size. Thousands of visitors flock here to the Titanic Museum to see the displays of opulent luxury, like the kind of first-class cabin which would have cost you thousands of pounds in today's money.
Previous transatlantic liners had offered sumptuous suites and fancy dining, but on board the Titanic, everything was bigger and better. The very finest cabins were decorated in historical styles. They had their own private promenade deck, fireplaces, ensuite bathrooms, electric lighting and heaters, and buttons to call valet service.
The Titanic also had the first heated onboard pool, a Turkish steam room, squash court, gymnasium, and library. This lost world now lies 2 miles beneath the waves, with one very special exception. At a secret location in rural Derbyshire, retired engineer John Siggins has spent the last 25 years painstakingly rebuilding his own little corner of the Titanic.
John, what have you got here? I've just stepped into a completely different world.
Time
coming
capsule.
into here. An absolute time capsule.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? If you listen, you hear the engines.
Have you recreated that
That's
as
the
well?
engines, yeah, in the background.
And all this here.
That's all the original silverware, as would have been used on Titanic.
Can I have a sit down and just
Yeah,
see what it feels like
yeah,
to
sit
experience?
in the. That's a first-class dining room chair. That.
Okay, then we'll
Original.
sit around here.
This is how the first class would have ate their meals.
This has all been sourced from Olympic.
Yeah.
So it would have been what, the exact same stuff on
Yeah,
Titanic?
Yeah. This would have been used on board the ship, the same.
The service and the experience that you were getting on board Titanic in first
Yeah.
class, it was up there with the highest hotels in the world.
Yeah.
The
Oh, yeah.
highest.
Yeah. Well, it was a 5-star hotel on the sea.
So those first class passengers weren't necessarily bothered about going on board a ship. They just wanted luxury around them.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole point was for the upper classes to feel like they were either back in their stately homes or dining out in style.
So what have you got here, John? This looks like...
This menu is what the first class would have eaten.
Okay.
That's the 14th, that one.
Oh, so that's...
So that's the day before the ship sank.
Yeah. I mean, this gives you a bit of an example of what,
Example of
those
what they
first-class
ate.
passengers
Yeah,
were.
yeah.
5, 6, 7, 8,
Nine courses.
There's 9 courses on there.
Yeah, yeah.
Dessert and coffee. I mean,
Yeah.
that's typical, is it, of a first-class meal on
Yeah,
board?
yeah, it would have been, yeah.
Can I have
Yeah,
pick it up and have a
yeah,
little
yeah.
look? I'm just
You're
gonna-
right. Yeah.
So this is a what, teacup?
That's just a normal teacup, that is.
A normal
yeah.
teacup.
And it'll have a date stamped on the bottom.
Yeah, April 1909.
1909, yeah, yeah.
It's
That's a
on-
teacup, that's a coffee cup. That's what they call a beef tea mug.
There's even different mugs for different types of tea, different
Yeah, different
times
teas.
of day, different...
Yeah, different types of stuff they use. They use different patterns throughout the day. They're grape scissors.
Grape scissors?
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
No, you cut grapes with them.
They've commissioned specifically...
For cutting grapes in half.
Well, can't you just...
No, posh people never did that. That was a bit rough. You had to have a pair of scissors to cut them. Okay. Be civil.
Well, I mean, come on, yeah, that's very uncouth, isn't it, John? I mean, where are my manners? I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that sometimes you might just take your meals in here? Just
do.
As a... Do you?
Yeah, we have our meals at Christmas. We sit in here and have our Christmas dinner in here.
Do you go to these extents?
Yeah. Don't
Get
use
all
those
the cutlery
plates.
out?
I don't use those plates.
No, because you wouldn't want to put those in the dishwasher.
No, I don't use the plates. I've got other plates. I've got some P&O ones.
While the privileged few enjoyed the top decks of the Titanic, the less wealthy majority occupied the spaces below.
Poor as some people were, it's a bit of a myth that third-class travel on the Titanic was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Admittedly, it was further down in the bowels of the ship, but there was separate accommodation for families and single men and women. Freshly prepared hot meals were served 4 times a day, all part of the price of your ticket. The food was even served by stewards in White Star Line livery.
The luxury of first class on board Titanic is legendary, but even third class was said to be better than second class on rival ships. It was all part of White Star Line's plan to attract repeat business from emigrants.
Most of those passengers would be travelling as what we call chain migration. They would be going over to America to create a bridgehead. Then they would send money back to the old country and they would bring back other members of the family. And gradually, the White Star Line would get even more profit from bringing further members of the family over. And this meant that the White Star Line constantly had a tap of more migrants.
The White Star Line wanted emigrant passengers to recommend the Titanic to everyone they knew, so they were handled with a respect that many had never even seen at home.
It wasn't treating people as just a one-way, quick fix, get them on the ship and get them off the other way. Because a bad experience for that migrant meant the potential of losing 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 more migrants in the future.
Steerage on the Titanic was like a whole neighbourhood, with families living, eating and socialising together, whilst right beneath their feet was the incessant throb of the mighty engines powering the liner across the Atlantic.
Titanic's engines needed to produce enough raw power to push over 52,000 tons across the Atlantic at up to 21 knots, about 25 miles an hour. At the Titanic Museum, immersive computer graphics give you an awe-inspiring sense of what it took to fire up the biggest mobile power plant in the world.
This just gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of what was on board Titanic. We're down here in the engine rooms with all the mechanics moving. You can imagine the noise this would have been making all around. Everything's just enormous.
Titanic's engines produced 46,000 horsepower and enough electricity to light up a town. Back in the real world, locomotives are the last surviving machines where you can see the raw power of steam for yourself.
The boilers on board the Titanic were roughly 4 times the size as the one on this locomotive, and there were 29 of them lined up along the bottom of the ship. they generated the steam to power the enormous propellers.
The Titanic had 3 propellers. The 2 on either side for manoeuvring weighed 38 tons each. The central propeller in front of the rudder was brought in for top speed cruising.
This colossal pile of coal here weighs in at about 120 tons. But to feed the insatiable appetite of the fires raging in its furnace, the Titanic needed 600 tons of coal every day. That's 5 piles like this every day for 6 days.
The Titanic had over 150 stokers shoveling coal round the clock in the bowels of the ship. At full steam, she had 162 furnaces lit.
The furious energy from all that steam powered 4 reciprocating engines. A bit like pistons moving in and out of cylinders on a car engine, but these were the biggest ever built, each one the size of a 3-story house.
For efficiency at high speed, the Titanic also deployed the very latest military technology, a turbine engine powered by the low-pressure steam leaving the pistons.
Everything about the Titanic was the last word in high tech. Electric lights, remote-controlled safety systems, and a newfangled invention that could keep ships in touch with each other across large distances: radio.
But how effective were the first radios? John Siggin's 100-year-old wireless set is still ready for action.
Goodness me, what have we got here, John?
Right, that's your Marconi spark gap transmitter.
That spark then, what is transformed into a radio signal, which is then broadcast
which is broadcast outwardly.
How old is this machine here, do we know?
That's going to be about 120-year-old, somewhere around there, yeah.
And so something like this was on Titanic, was it?
Yeah, very similar.
This was state-of-the-art technology at the time.
It was at the time.
In 1912, communication between ships at night still relied on coded sequences of rockets fired from the deck. But at nighttime, powerful radio signals bounced off the upper atmosphere to reach other radios beyond the curvature of the Earth.
Can I have a go and try and tap out the old SOS
have a go.
on here?
Off you go.
So it's dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot.
Yeah.
SOS. Let's try it then. SOS.
That's it. That's simple. During the day, they weren't so good, but at night time, they could travel up to 500 miles.
That's how powerful a signal on this is.
Yeah. If I connected that to an area, it might affect the police headquarters up here.
As powerful as this new technology was, the Titanic's radio operators were mainly kept busy making money from it, as a plaything of the wealthy.
Radio was also an exciting innovation, enabling passengers to send messages back to people on shore, if they could afford the cost of it, that was. In today's money, a 10-word message would have cost around £40, so they tended to be kept quite short and succinct. Messages like this one: "Fine voyage, fine ship." But around 9:30 p.m. on the 14th of April, as the Titanic neared the subarctic waters off Newfoundland, the messages she started receiving from other ships nearby took an ominous turn. Warnings of an ice field ahead. After 4 days at sea, the Titanic was 400 miles from land when it entered an ice field several miles wide. Nearby, ships like the Californian had stopped for the night, waiting for daylight to pick their way through the ice floes. But on the Titanic, Captain Smith didn't even order a reduction in speed.
It was a very cold night. In fact, the day had been so cold they'd cancelled lifeboat practice. Not perhaps a sensible thing to do in the circumstances with benefit of hindsight. She was going fast. even in these icy conditions. This wasn't unusual at the time. It was thought that the lookouts would be able to spot bergs in time, and so it wasn't anything special, but in the event it turned out to be extremely dangerous.
To spot an iceberg on a dark night, lookouts would usually search for large silhouettes against the horizon, or white waves breaking around the base of a berg. But a low, dark shape was suddenly spotted, only a ship's length ahead.
It would appear that atmospheric conditions prevented the lookouts in the foremast seeing the iceberg in time. But eventually they did see it, and they called upon the ship to turn, to try and avoid it. And the tragedy of it is, she almost did, but not quite. And so she scrapes along the side of the iceberg, and the iceberg under the water punches holes, takes off rivets, and punctures a whole series of small openings in the right-hand starboard side of the ship, and this causes water to cascade inside.
The iceberg gouged thin slits in the hull, no wider than a hand's width. But crucially, they were dotted along the whole front third of the ship. But how could ice have ruptured solid steel in the first place?
It seems crazy that ice could cut through mild steel an inch thick, but the colossal forces involved in this phenomenal collision are all about sheer scale. So of course, the ice here is softer than metal. You can see in this battle, it's the metal wins as the ice is breaking up. That means the metal is harder than the ice.
But the berg that sank the Titanic is estimated to have been at least 20,000 tons of solid ice. They weren't going to just bounce off each other. If sheer mass holds the ice in one place, it pushes back against the metal.
But with the ice firmly in my vise here, if I now take my metal plate, which represents the hull of the Titanic, and if I run that along the top of the ice, there's maybe a bit of smoothing off of the surface of that ice there, but this metal plate is getting dented and bent right up. Now, when metal is continuously bent or stretched, it reaches something called its tensile strength. That's the point where it breaks or tears or cracks open. And on the Titanic, there's also a possibility that those forces started to pop the rivets out of the joints.
Up on deck, even people who'd noticed the impact didn't seem alarmed. Why did they find it so hard to believe they were in danger? The Titanic's reputation was built on safety features that were designed to cope with all known threats to shipping. Like other ships, it was divided vertically into sections by bulkheads, walls running from the bottom to the top of a ship. Each of the resulting compartments had watertight doors to stop a leak from spreading the length of the ship.
To make space for the large rooms on top, the Titanic's bulkheads stopped here, beneath the first-class facilities. But this wasn't a compromise on safety from the designers, quite the opposite.
Regulations of the time demanded that ships had to be able to stay afloat with any one of these compartments flooded. Titanic had 16 watertight compartments and could survive up to 4 of them flooding. She also had a barrage of steam-powered pumps to slow down any rising water in the engine rooms.
The Titanic had more of the latest safety features than any other civilian ship of its time. That's why the buzz surrounding its construction earned it the reputation of being the unsinkable ship.
When the Titanic steamed into the iceberg, Captain Smith ordered an immediate stop to assess the damage.
The radio operator, Jack Phillips, started transmitting alerts to any nearby ships to come with assistance. Whilst they waited, Captain Smith tried to find the answers to 2 main questions. Were they sinking? And if so, how long would it take?
The Titanic was built to remain afloat with up to 4 of its watertight compartments flooded. Water was now rushing into at least 5 of them. But with the rest of the compartments remaining intact, they were estimated to keep the ship afloat long enough for help to arrive. 25 minutes after hitting the iceberg, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be prepared and the band to start playing to raise spirits. But passengers were slow to muster on the freezing cold deck. Why did the crew and passengers alike seem to feel like they were in so little danger?
The belief at all levels that Titanic was unsinkable meant that on this very cold night, and if you were a rich American lady or a rich British duchess or something, were you really going to get into a lifeboat on a cold evening when all this beautifully lit ship with the orchestra still playing was giving you a great sense of security? Of course you would.
The majority of people on board were on the lower decks. Those scrambling to escape the rising water were met by a maze of corridors, locked gates and stairs.
They had never rehearsed boat drill. That's a disaster. Therefore, people had no idea where to go. The first-class passengers were closest to the boats and they could virtually all speak English. So could the second-class passengers. The third-class passengers, steerage, were emigrants. Many of them couldn't speak English at all.
There are no photographs of the Titanic's final hours. But this model in the Ulster Transport Museum is based on survivors' accounts, when confusion was turning to panic. Even an hour after the impact, Captain Smith hadn't instructed the officers to evacuate the passengers.
Up on deck, everything now depended on the lifeboats. With the ship leaning dangerously forward, the crew started launching, women and children first. But why were there only 20 boats to accommodate less than half the passengers on board?
In their minds, the Titanic, if it did get into any form of distress, there were so many vessels travelling from the west and the east that at any one time you could guarantee there would be a vessel within hailing distance of your particular ship.
And it took some time between the strike of the iceberg, the collision, and it actually sinking. So
if a vessel had come to the assistance of the Titanic, then you and I wouldn't be here talking today.
Why did no one come to the aid of the Titanic before she sank? There were 5 other ships navigating the ice field. When Titanic fired off rocket flares to attract attention, they were seen by the Californian. But why didn't it take action?
Back then, there was some ambiguity about what these rockets represented. Was it distress, or was it a vessel signalling to another vessel at sea? That was a way that we could communicate to sea if that vessel didn't carry wireless. Nowadays, if you see any pyrotechnics at sea, immediately we know that's distress.
With the rockets being ignored, it was down to the wireless operator to get a distress call through to any ship that had a radio. The Carpathia responded, but it was almost 60 miles away across the ice field. Again, the closest ship, the Californian, didn't respond.
The problem with other radio operators, though, infamously in the Californian, is that they closed down. You weren't supposed to keep radio watch on a 24-hour basis. And this meant that not all ships in the vicinity picked up the signals.
with the ship now dipping precariously forwards, the lifeboat's state-of-the-art winches were becoming trapped and tangled. 2 of the lifeboats were yet to be launched when, at 1:45 a.m., the Titanic's final message was received. Come quick, engine room nearly full. The nearest ship was still more than 2 hours away. By 1:40 a.m., water had been gushing into the front 6 compartments of the Titanic for 2.5 hours. The situation was now critical. The bow was so heavy, it tilted the stern clean out of the water. And without the water around it to support the weight of the massive engines near the back, the keel started to bend, and the steel plates of the hull were torn apart.
The Titanic had managed to stay afloat thanks to its remaining watertight compartments. But when the bow of the Titanic finally went under, it only took minutes for the whole ship to disappear. Why did the safest ship on the sea come to such a swift and catastrophic end?
This plastic box represents the Titanic, and you can see I've got it divided into these watertight compartments. Now you also see at the front here, I've drilled some holes. Now they represent the compromise to the Titanic's hull when it struck the iceberg, but I've got those taped up for the minute. So if I pop this into the water, unsurprisingly, it floats. To make this model more representative, we need to add a little bit of weight, a bit of ship's ballast, so that it sits down in the water like the hull of a ship would. There we go. That's more like it. And you can see that these divisions between the watertight compartments on the Titanic didn't go all the way to the top of the ship. Instead, they only came up about halfway to allow for those large open spaces in the first class accommodation. So if I now take this tape off and open up the holes to the water in the front compartment here. So that goes in, it floats still, but we need to get our ballast weight back in the middle. Let's carefully pop those back in. So, it doesn't take long for water to start pouring in because those holes were all beneath the waterline. So water floods into that first compartment of the ship. Water keeps coming in slowly now. The water starts to tip over the top of that bulkhead and enters into the second part of the ship. And once that starts to happen, the ship goes down very, very quickly. And that's what happened on the Titanic.
Because it only took a shallow angle for water to spill over the top of the bulkheads, the Titanic was engulfed in a lethal chain reaction. But why wasn't she built to withstand such a long gouge in the hull?
There's a common misconception about the Titanic that she was badly built, that she wasn't built to withstand that collision with the iceberg. And that is just not fair. It's not true, in fact, and it's not fair on the builders and on the White Star Line, because the Titanic was built in excess of the legal requirements of shipbuilding in 1912. It was the finest quality craftsmanship that went into that vessel. And they always said at the time, if it's Belfast built, it's well built. But nobody contemplated that amount of underwater damage. Any other vessel wouldn't have remained afloat for a fraction of the time.
The Titanic was built to be one of the safest ships of its day. Its sister ship, the Olympic, survived another 21 years.
Olympic had a very successful career. She became known as Old Reliable. She actually rams and sinks a German submarine. And so it demonstrates that the basic design of the Titanic was fine, as long as you didn't drive it at high speed into icebergs.
The Titanic sank because no steel ship had ever experienced this kind of damage. But many lifeboats left with empty spaces, so could more have been done to save lives?
Really, most of the criticisms should fall with Captain Smith, because Captain Smith's responsibility is to every man, woman and child on board the ship. Not in living memory for those men in 1912 had a disaster befallen a ship on such a scale. They could not contemplate such a catastrophe. And I firmly believe that Captain Smith has a form of mental breakdown. And that freeze in command, you can see going all the way through, right down to junior officers and ratings lowering the boats. They didn't realise the importance and magnitude of the coming disaster.
Until it was too late.
Until it was too late. There are undoubtedly 700 unnecessary deaths.
Human error is ultimately responsible for the loss of life on board the Titanic. But there were many people who, by their own acts of heroism, saved lives too. After the impact, the engineers returned to the flooding compartments to keep the power going and prevent the ship from plunging into darkness. Most had likely drowned before a single lifeboat had been launched. And when Captain Smith finally ordered the crew to abandon ship, not everyone obeyed.
Captain Smith eventually says to the crew, it's every man for himself, and he tries to get Phillips, the radio operator, to leave his post. But a great professional that he was, he wouldn't. He kept on signalling until finally the water came in, and that was the end of him.
Following naval tradition, Captain Smith also went down with the ship. 5 years earlier, he'd claimed that modern shipbuilding had eliminated any possible threats that could cause a liner to sink.
There are 3 lessons which were quite rapidly accepted after the Titanic disaster. The first was you had to have a 24-hour radio watch. Secondly, you've got to have enough lifeboats. They were not just there to transfer part of the passengers to another ship. You had to have enough lifeboats for everybody to be able to get in and wait for rescue. Thirdly, there was the International Iceberg Organization, which gave ships due warning of ice. So those 3 were the great lessons, and they made the high seas on the North Atlantic in particular a great deal safer.
The tragedy of a so-called unsinkable ship suffering such a catastrophic loss of life still grips our imaginations over 100 years on. But perhaps thanks to the lessons learned, that we should never be so complacent to blindly put all our faith in structures and machines. There's never been another Titanic.